Hey grade 4s, Mrs. Pond and Robbie. The book we are going to be reading is Hardy Boy Adventures, Tunnel of Secrets. Chapter 1, Swallowed Whole. My brother Joe was already more than 6 feet underground when one of our hometown's most famous landmarks fell through a giant hole in the earth. It was early Saturday afternoon. Just about all of Bayport had been planning to attend a street fair on the other side of town, but last week's disappearance of a couple of Bayport high school kids had put a stop to that. Instead, most of the townspeople were gathered on the lawn of the square in front of the city hall, waiting for Deputy Hickson to start a press conference. With our esteemed and grumpy chief of police, Olaf, on vacation, the job of leading the investigation had fallen to his young protege, but since Deputy Hickson's daughter, Layla, happened to be one of the missing kids, he had a lot more at stake than just impressing his boss. I felt bad for Deputy Hickson. He's a good cop. He also a lot nicer than Chief Olaf. When Joe and I interfere with a police investigation, what kind of happens a lot, as Bayport's foremost amateur detectives, Joe and I have a special knack for solving crimes. It isn't our fault that a couple of teenagers happen to be better at it than the local police. We weren't officially looking into the missing kids, but Joe was friends with Layla and think he liked her as more than a friend too, so we were keeping a close eye on things. Joe wasn't at the press conference though. He was under it. He was helping Urbix, the local urban explorers club, map some of the old tunnels hidden under Bayport. The same tunnels that we had helped discovered on another case. Police press conferences were usually pretty dull anyway, so we didn't think we'd be missing much. But I wasn't just at the press conference to investigate. I was also there as a photographer. A camera can be one of detectives' most important tools, and I was intent on learning my way around my new digital SLR. Make sure to get some shots of Hickson's wife too, Hardy, a sweet voice said, not so sweetly behind me. It would be great if you could get her crying while he's talking. The readers really eat it up, that emotional stuff. I turned around to find Charlene Val scribbling in the little notebook she carried everywhere. Charlene was the news bloggers for our high school newspaper, and to be honest, she was another reason I was at the press conference. She was super smart and super cute, and I kind of had a little, okay, maybe not a little crush on her. She wasn't exactly warm and cuddly, though. Charlene took being an investigative reporter seriously, which I totally respected, even if it meant she was pretty intense sometimes. When I learned she was looking for a photojournalist to help document her stories, I joined the paper as a photographer. Once the press conference started, I opened up the aperture and used a longer lens. That will make the deputy in focus in the foreground with Delilah slightly blurred behind him, I told her. Charlene didn't look impressed. I don't care if you draw a picture with crayons as long as you get the shot. Okay, I said, feeling myself blush. Sometimes I forget that nobody gets as excited about technology as I do. Pretty big turnout, Charlene observed, thankfully changing the subject. The disappearance is a big story. I'd love to be able to outscoop the Bugle on this one. The Bugle was Bayport's daily newspaper, and it usually drew a lot more readers than our high school students' run website. Not always, though. Charlene had already beaten the Bugle to the punch on a couple other big headlines this year, and this was a big story. Hundreds of people had come out to see what the deputy had to say. Some of the town's homeless population. I noticed a guy in his 50s who everyone called Sal pushing a shopping cart past the courthouse steps. You know, I tried to interview him once for a story on Bayport's homeless population, Charlene said, pointing to Sal. He wrote no comment on a piece of paper and walked away. I guess no one told you he was mute, huh? I chuckled. Sal had been a fixture around Bayport for as long as I could remember. I always wondered what his story was, but since he never spoke out loud, I was never able to ask him. I'd sometimes see him mouthing things excitedly, only no sound ever came out. I hear Delilah Hickson is a member of the Mayflower Society, Charlene said as Sal pushed his cart past Layla's mom was standing waiting for her husband to address the crowd. Don't you have to be a descendant of one of the original pilgrims who sailed on the Mayflower to be a member of the Mayflower Society? I asked. The history nerd in me got me tingles. I hadn't realized any Bayport residents were related to some of the colony's first settlers way back in 1620. Charlene nodded. I found out while I was doing background for this story, they've been Bayport bigwigs since colonial times, living around here since before Bayport was Bayport, longer than that guy even, she said, pointing over her head to a large bronze statue of the colonial Navy officer that stood watch over the other end of the town square. You mean the Admiral? I asked, talking in the statue of Admiral T. Bryant, Revolutionary War hero of the seas and one of the town's foremost founding fathers. Did you know that Admiral Bryant's fleet of transatlantic merchant ships helped turn Bayport into a major commercial hub? I went on. He was friends with all kinds of important historical figures like Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin. In fact, if things had gone differently, he might have made it into the history books too. He had big plans to turn Bayport into one of the nation's great port cities, but he disappeared before he had a chance. That's why Bayport stayed the sleepy little town it is today. The Admiral's disappearance is one of Bayport's great mysteries. She gave me another unimpressed look. If I ever do a story on Admiral, I'll be sure to interview you. Apparently, I wasn't doing a good job impressing her with my knowledge of photographic technique or local history. Come to think of it, I can use Admiral Bryant's disappearance to draw parallels to what happened to Layla and Dan. It'll give the story historical context, she said, nodding to herself and jotting the idea down in her pen. See if you can get some shots with his statue in the background. You got it, I smiled. Score one for Frank Hardy. The statue really does kind of freak me out, though. Charlene shuddered. I keep thinking he's going to jump off the pedestal and start chasing me around with that giant fork of his. It was a spooky statue. The angry-looking, 20-foot-tall Admiral held a large trident in his right hand as if he were Poseidon, king of the sea. And if the trident, which actually did look a bit like the giant three-pronged fork, wasn't freaky enough, all you had to do was look at his other hand, which was missing its pinky and ring fingers from the battle seat. But that wasn't the most interesting thing about his left hand. It was holding the coolest looking book ever to his chest. The book was sealed with a clasp and engraved with these strange symbols like spirals, two-headed eagles, and an eye inside a floating pyramid similar to the one of the dollar bill. With his missing fingers and the way he was holding the book, it almost looked like the Admiral was giving the peace sign. There was also a great bronze skeleton's key dangling from the ring of his belt, the key to the city. What the trident and book symbolized, no one really knew for sure. According to the legend, Admiral Bryant's ghost still haunts the old graveyards across town. It's just waiting for his body to be returned to an empty spot in his family's tomb alongside his wife. The Admiral's tomb? Charlene asked. That doesn't make me feel any less freaked out by the statue. I started thinking about the Admiral's mysterious disappearance as Deputy Hickson approached the microphone. The statue almost seemed to be watching the press conference. From the other end of the square, it really did give the whole scene a sinister vibe. Thank you all for coming, Deputy Hickson said. I turned my attention and my camera back to the courthouse steps where he was standing. As you all know by now, 2 Bayport High School students went missing last week. Councilman Salt's son, Daniel, and my own daughter, Layla. Deputy Hickson had to pause to collect himself. I could see the pain on his face, and my heart went out to him. I knew firsthand how hard it was to have to investigate a family member's disappearance. So far, we have been unable to establish a clear connection between the children. They are 2 grades apart in school, but they don't seem to have known each other. What we do know is that a suspicious figure in a hood was seen following both students shortly before their disappearances, and we have to consider the possibility that they were both taken against their will. The crowd reacted with gasps and frightened murmurs. Please, everyone, stay calm, Deputy Hickson continued. I can assure you that Bayport PD has devoted every available resource to finding them. We ask that you remain vigilant but calm and continue to go about your lives as normal. As the deputy spoke, I could hear a rumbling sound in the distance, and I figured it was probably just thunder. It wasn't until a vibrating sensation in my feet that I realized the sound wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from below. There is no need to, the deputy started to stammer mid-sentence. As the rumbling grew more intense, people looked around in confusion. Panic! Deputy Hickson had barely gotten the final word out when boom! It felt like an earthquake, an explosion all at once. The ground rocked under our feet, and a huge cloud of dust erupted from the other end of the town square as the earth collapsed and swallowed, and the Admiral's statue fell whole. That's chapter 1. We'll do chapter 2 tomorrow with Robbie.